Well, hi everybody. I'm gonna kind of round out the day, I guess. So I'm an entomologist, so I'm going to talk about plants though, because I love plants, and the connection with insects and plants is obviously very intimate. I'm particularly going to talk about wildflowers, and what I want to do today is really kind of introduce a few common species that have broad utility for solar, for rights of way, for larger wildflower meadows, and then talk a lot about sort of establishment of wildflowers within a landscape, and then kind of end with some additional resources for finding out information and also for seed sourcing for a lot of these different species. So I just want to start out here because this would not have happened about 10 years ago. So this was the 2022 cover of Fresh from Florida magazine talking about the use of wildflowers along roadsides. And so finally, slowly but surely, the agricultural community is understanding that these other sort of non-traditional spaces, energy, solar, rights of way, roadsides, play an important role in not only maintaining biodiversity, but also kind of in the future of Florida agricultural production. Instead of taking an agricultural or agro-ecosystem and taking land out of production to provide resources to attract and maintain and sustain pollinators, a lot of the adjacent landscapes have very viable means to do that. And they're managed lands, they're already being managed for a variety of different purposes. And many of these utilities or uses provide dual benefit, right? They can provide biodiversity services, soil erosion prevention, carbon sequestration, and also beautification in the broader landscape. So we are slowly emerging into a broader understanding that how we manage the urban core of where we as humans live impacts multiple different systems and multiple different industries. And I want to talk about some of the species particularly, and this one was mentioned earlier in the day. So this is dotted horsemint, Monarda punctata, and this is kind of a heavy lifting wildflower. As mentioned before, it does get fairly tall. It can get to 3 or 4 feet in height or even higher. So it's not necessarily for under solar, but within other solar landscapes in the perimeter or within open areas within the array, it can be very, very useful. It attracts a huge range of different pollinating species, from bees and wasps, which are the kind of the primary pollinators for this, but also leps like the great purple hairstreak that you see down here. And it's also highly ornamental. It's very much kind of what you're seeing as the dominant color here is actually colorful bracts. The flowers themselves are actually these little kind of pale purple spotted kind of curved tuliped flowers that these bees and wasps are foraging on. It's also incredibly drought tolerant once it's established. It's almost an impossible plant to kill once it's established, so it has a lot of lasting value within the landscape. It's also a really good self-seeder, so it does and proliferates within the landscape significantly. And the downside to sort of my introduction to the species that are going to be widely utilized is it's much like the chicken and the egg, right? We all can envision, we all know native wildflower species that we would consider as really ideal for attracting pollinators or providing pollinator habitat, but the vast majority of those are not commercially available. So there's a very narrow range of species that are produced in the quantity that would be appropriate for larger scale landscape use, and also at a price point where agricultural use or solar or rights of way would actually be viable. So we're sort of just emerging into that world where more and more species are going into production, but it does become kind of that chicken and the egg where there's a growing need, but there's not the production to support that need. So they're not quite meeting yet in the middle. And right now in full bloom, if you want to come over to the Florida Museum of Natural History, where I work, behind the Florida Museum to the west of the Florida Museum, we put in about a 2-acre plot of wildflowers. There's about 25 species here, but what you're seeing in full bloom is Monarda punctata, and it looks like a single culture of that plant. It's in full bloom, and the number of insect flower visitors is just exponential within that landscape. So come on over and check that out. Partridge pea, this is another one that's was included in kind of the solar studies, and this is a dual use plant for a lot of reasons. It's an incredibly valuable forage for game birds, other wildlife. It's a legume, so it is a nitrogen fixer. It's a great source for pollen for bees. It's also a larval house plant for these 4 species of butterflies: the cloudless sulfur, the gray hair streak, the little sulfur, and the Serranus blue. All feed on this plant in one time in their life. It's a great bee plant overall, and then it's also because it has extrafloral nectaries on the petioles of the leaves. It draws in a wide range of other beneficial insects, from wasps, from ants. So it's in many ways, a ubiquitous plant. We see it in kind of fallow areas, waste areas. It's kind of a weedy plant, but it has so much wildlife intrinsic value. It should be really elevated to the biodiversity service realm of what wildflower species are beneficial for. And it's also an incredibly aggressive plant in the landscape and kind of a superseder. So it's one of these that you have in your landscape, you probably will always have in your landscape through time. It kind of projectiles out its seeds at maturity, and it really does kind of create these larger monocultures. And I'll talk a little bit about that, because this is one species that if you do include it in mixes, it can outcompete a lot of the other wildflower species that you're trying to grow. Blanket flower, or Indian blanket, is another one. This has kind of fallen a little bit out of favor with sort of the native wildflower community, because recent evidence shows that this is actually not a native to the southeastern US. So it's a naturalized wildflower. So depending on where you are in that kind of purity range of spectrum, you either like it or you don't, or if you're a native plant purist, again, it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's a rock stable wildflower because it can tolerate incredibly challenging conditions. It can grow on coastal areas. It's salt tolerant. It's planted widely on roadways where, of course, there's very little management. There's no irrigation. So it is a really hardy, viable plant. It is considered an annual or a very short-lived perennial, but again, it does self-sow quite a bit, and it can be a really useful plant for really poor soils, really drought heavy areas, and it draws in a wide range of different pollinating organisms like a magnet, especially smaller bees, wasps, some small butterflies, and it provides kind of that visual interest in the landscape where a lot of other wildflowers sort of maybe don't have that pop of color. And no matter how you slice it, whether you're on a solar field or an agricultural field, color in the neighboring community, visual appeal and beauty is also a really viable, important feature to a lot of these spaces. Black-eyed Susan. So this is actually in our trials on agricultural landscapes, the #1 pollinator attractor that we tested. It again is a short-lived perennial in the landscape. It's kind of that old-fashioned flower, very easy to propagate, grows in a wide range of different conditions, and it draws in a very wide range of native bees, wasps, and other insects, and has multiple flowering periods during the year as well. So it can also be mowed and then reflower. So it has a lot of ubiquity and a lot of flexibility within the landscape. It is another kind of true standard for a lot of roadside plantings as well. And then our state wildflower, which is really the state wildflower genus Coreopsis. There are a number of different ones. These are the 3 most commercially available and probably the easiest to establish within landscapes. They look quite similar to one another, but they vary a little bit. So Golden Mane Coreopsis, or dye flower, is a true annual. This is an early season annual. It's often seen kind of in those mass plantings along roadways, often paired with drum and phlox. So that's the one that you see people pulling over the side of the road, getting a selfie, creates those really large landscape, beautiful shots. But it does die back pretty early in the season. Once the heat of summer comes on, it attracts a wide range of different species, particularly small bees, wasps, some small butterflies. You'll see a lot of flies on the blossoms as well. It self-seeds really easily within the landscape, is incredibly inexpensive. in bulk rates. So it's a go-to source for DOT and agricultural enhancements. Leavenworth coreopsis is another one that's a short-lived perennial or an annual, depending on the situation. It likes slightly more mesic soils. So this is a good one for sort of mesic roadside ditches, slightly more heavy soils, or areas that might get a little bit more irrigation, or lower areas within the landscape. It can also create these large monocultures very easily. A lot of small pollinating insects will go to it as well. And then one that's been widely used across many areas of the US, particularly on utility easements, roadsides, is landsleaf tickseed or landsleaf coreopsis. And this is a kind of a true golden-like flower. It is a perennial, and it will bloom within the first year if established early in the season. It can be mowed and managed quite well to really create a monoculture, and it's one of the few species of coreopsis, because of the dense vegetative growth, it can outcompete or at least choke out some of the surrounding weed growth. So it's a good one for sort of density heavy plantings to abate weed growth within larger landscapes. And all of these also would be theoretically at a height level that would be appropriate within and around solar without creating any impact to solar arrays. And then one that would not necessarily be appropriate within the array, but in open areas within a solar field. This is one that is actually one of my favorites. It's highly underutilized. It's button rattlesnake master, or button oringio. This is one that we've tried. We have another concurrent project where we're creating habitat on FDOT managed retention basins across Northeast Florida. Of all the plants that we have tried via seed plugs and containerized plants, this is one that we have lost less than 1% of all the plants put in the ground. So it's incredibly durable. It establishes very quickly. It's highly adaptable to a range of soil types, from mesic to incredibly dry. Once it's established, it's incredibly drought tolerant. Has a very long bloom period. Plants can get quite tall, and they have these sort of true kind of button globulose flowers that draw in a wide variety of wasps and other beneficials as well. So it's a good companion plant to agriculture for attracting beneficials. It has long strap-like leaves that have kind of elongated barbs on them. So it's one that you do need gloves to work with, but it has a lot of utility, and I think it's widely underutilized in many landscapes. And then one to mention, just because of the popularity of the monarch and the fact that many utility companies are part of the monarch candidate conservation agreement with assurances for energy and transportation providers. Many solar plantings now are purposefully trying to include monarch-friendly plantings, and larval host plants are obviously a portion of that. So butterfly milkweed is probably the most appropriate for larger mass plantings within solar, primarily because the seed source is fairly available. It's a higher price seed, but most of the solar areas are poor soil, sand, or very dry adapted upland community areas. So this is a very appropriate plant. This is a sandhill or pineland species, so very drought tolerant once established. It can take a long time to get established, and it's also has generally a poor germination rate with the seeds, but once you do get it established, it is a long-standing growth perennial and provides a lot of benefit for pollinator conservation, as well as a host plant for both the monarch butterfly and the queen butterfly in much of the deep south. And then to kind of segue a little bit to wildflower establishment, this could be a whole talk in of itself, but I just want to highlight some of the main takeaways from this. And if you want to check out the EDIS document that we created, this has a guide to establishment of wildflower plantings in Florida. And just a few things to mention. A lot boils down to wildflower selection. So there are many different species available, a limited array that are commercially available at larger bulk rates, but it's incredibly important that you select seed that is local and as local as possible within Florida, and particularly produced within Florida. So we have done trials with a variety of the same species that you saw here that are from ecotypes from North Carolina, Ohio, Colorado, Texas, and they do not perform well in Florida. They have different phenologies, they have different plant form. Many just are not productive. So try to source your seed from as local a source as possible, and particularly try to get plants, seed sources that are produced in Florida. And then really important, if your goal is to create true pollinator habitat, to ensure that your mixes of or selection of species include species that have a bloom period that encompasses the 12 months of the year in Florida. So picking species that bloom in spring, summer, fall, and a small number that would also bloom in the winter months, because we do have pollinators that are active year-round within the Sunshine State, and really important to build up and provide resources for those populations throughout the collective 12 months of the year. And then site preparation and planting is really critical to success. And as mentioned earlier today, it's really about weed abatement. The bulk of the weed pressure in Florida is just outrageous. It's just incredibly difficult to control weeds and to make sure that those weeds do not impact your establishment and the long-term kind of growth of those wildflower plantings. So site preparation is really key, and we recommend no-till or minimum till methods. You don't want to break the soil surface and kind of unleash the kraken of weed seeds that are in that soil. So we recommend starting early with multiple rounds of glyphosate. And if you look at kind of the bottom diagram here, if you're thinking about establishment, you're really looking at a very longitudinal planting scale. So we're really talking about almost 4 months of site preparation, multiple rounds of an herbicide, a short-lived herbicide that's going to kind of knock down that weed growth. We want to mow as close to the soil surface as possible, kind of scalp the soil so that once you do seed, you provide as much seed to soil contact as possible to enable those seeds to get a really good establishment. You can then mow after wildflowers begin to come up if you have weed pressure as well, or use a post-emergent herbicide as well. But really it boils down to as much pre-treatment and planning that will considerably impact your success long-term. You can, of course, use solarization, but solarization is very inefficient at large scale. It's good for smaller scale. And there's also research out there looking at sort of really deep till methods, like going down, 2.5, 3 feet and tilling the soil surface over, but that's incredibly expensive and requires very specialized equipment. So really, at the end of the day, that kind of herbicide mowing treatment is going to be the most effective at getting and controlling the weed pressure and getting plants established. We do, of course, recommend that if possible, and again, this is highly unrealistic in agricultural and solar areas, but irrigation, if you have it available, even for a minimal period of time, really enhances establishment. So if you're dealing with an area that you would have the ability to put some irrigation on, it's really useful. And then keep in mind that, even when you go to sources for seeding rate like NRCS or others, that there's still not a lot of data on what is the effective seeding rate for a lot of these species. And we know also that some, like partridge pea, can be really, really aggressive. They can dominate the entire area, even at a really low seeding rate. So when we did some of our trials on agricultural lands, we took the NRS seeding rate with partridge pea and we cut it down to 1/4 of that, and it was still too much. It outcompeted the other wildflowers. So for really aggressive species, we recommend spatial segregation within the landscape, creating kind of independent monocultural plots of those really aggressive species adjacent to wildflower mixes really provides the best possible long-term maximization of diversity within the landscape. And I just want to end today by talking a little bit about some additional resources. There are a lot out there. We work a lot with the Florida Wildflower Foundation and the Florida Wildflower Growers Cooperative within Florida. And the Florida Wildflower Foundation has been increasingly generating really high quality products. So whether you're dealing with homeowners or other folks within your community, they offer a number of different resources that are really useful. They produce this smaller booklet called 20 Easy to Grow Wildflowers. Many of these are appropriate at larger scale or to scale up for larger mass plantings. And then they have a very prolific list of plant profiles on their website, which are really good if you're interested in just either identifying flowers in the field or just looking at, hey, what do these individual species need for cultural conditions? So they're really providing a wealth of resources that are available. And then they also have some other booklets and PDFs available. I find these to be particularly useful. They have one looking at seeding dates for Florida native wildflowers and grasses. And while most generally recommend seeding in late fall, early winter, it does vary depending on species. So this is a really good cultural guide to providing broader guidance for when to sow and how to sow. And then kind of broader documents looking at the resources available and kind of what they attract individually. And then other guides down here for dry landscapes, shady landscapes, and so forth. And then last, if you're interested in sort of looking for sources for bulk seed, there are few and far between good sources. So these are two that I would recommend. The Florida Wildflower Growers Cooperative. This is a good one, has good bulk seed available. It's kind of a little bit, Curtis, who runs it, is kind of operated out of his house. So oftentimes you have a hard time getting hold of them, but they do offer a lot of good bulk seed. And then Ernst is good because they do offer a lot of Florida eco-type seed, or Atlanta or sort of Georgia or South Carolina, Atlantic coastal plain eco-type seeds. So again, try to buy as local as possible, but these are some additional resources for sourcing your seed production. Thank you very much.